All right, hello everyone. Happy fall. My name is Adrian, and today we are going to be recording our September education session. Today's topic is taking care of yourself, self-care for caregivers, and I really wanted to create something for caregivers to have an online resource so they could keep coming back to it if they needed to. So today I wanted to welcome Wendy Johnstone. Hello, Wendy.
Hello.
So a lot of people might recognize Wendy. She used to work for NBIS, coordinating the Community Navigator program. And she is a caregiver coach and program consultant with Family Caregivers of BC. So today we're gonna dive into a workshop with Wendy, and I will let her say a little bit more about herself. And there you go.
Well, thank you, Adrian. It's nice to see you. Nice to be back virtually at NBIS. I miss the team there and miss all the clients and caregivers. Yeah, so one of my other roles, of course, is I work for an organization in British Columbia called the Family Caregivers of British Columbia. And our mission is really to provide support and education for family caregivers. We're dedicated 100% to family caregivers. And so there's lots of different topics around caregiving. And we come across from the perspective of a very more general approach to caregiving. So we're not disease specific. We try and take some global topics and make them accessible for all caregivers, regardless of, who you're caring for, what disease or illness is being faced, and regardless of where you are along that caregiving journey. So bear with me while I get acquainted with this type of remote system, but we're going to start the presentation. Some of this presentation I'm going to quickly sort of move through the slides and kind of get to the real meat of taking care of yourself. So we'll kind of start here. And I think I can just press the button and it should move the slide. There we go. So what we're going to cover today is this idea of the importance of support in your caregiving role. Kind of taking pause and thinking about your current level of self-care. This idea of self-compassion and the importance of support networks, and this idea of resiliency, all really important parts of caregiving. Just a little bit about who we are. We have a really wide range of services. So we talked about this idea that we're a nonprofit charity that's dedicated 100% to the well-being of family caregivers. We've been around for 30 years. We're the first of its kind in Canada, and there's only 3 provincial organizations like ours across Canada. Over the past 5 years, we've been part of the Ministry of Health Patients as Partners initiative, and our main pillars, our number 1 is around caregiver support, the second one is education, and the third one is engagement and collaboration. And so we have a dedicated caregiver support line. We do information, referral, and navigation. We have virtual support groups right now through COVID. We have an amazing resource library online virtually. We've got webinars and podcasts. We do, coaching one-to-one. So lots of support for family caregivers. We always like to start with the definition of a family caregiver. So really it's a family member or a friend who's providing care and support to someone living with a disease or disability or frailty due to aging. And the role of the family caregiver is typically, mutually defined between the person providing the care as well as the person receiving the care. And I think the really important thing that I like to remind individuals that are caring or even living with someone who does have a brain injury is sometimes one of the hardest aspects is just identifying as a family caregiver. Sometimes we don't like that label, which is okay. But just identifying your role and how you're supporting someone through their own recovery or ongoing recovery is a really big step to just recognizing that family caregiving doesn't happen in isolation. So it doesn't, usually you're balancing a family, you're balancing a relationship, you're balancing work, you're balancing, volunteer, you're balancing self-care. And so it can feel quite complex, and that's also normal and common. So we always like to, sometimes we focus on the negative aspects of caregiving because it's the ones that we see the most. And we always like to remind that most of the people we interact with, they have a very positive relationship in a caregiving role or the person that they're caring for. It's very life-changing for all caregivers. And so while there are many positive aspects, we like to start with that and focus on that because most of us want to provide support. We want to help someone recover. We want to help them through some of their challenges. Having said that, though, if we don't care for ourselves, if we aren't able to, that's where some of the negative aspects or the less desirable aspects of caregiving, can creep into that relationship. So we just talk a bit about, I like to remind people that 28% of Canadians are family caregivers, so it's a huge issue. And in British Columbia alone, we're over 1.3 million, and so it's quite staggering the number of family caregivers across the province. When we were talking about family caregiver, caregiving, how it doesn't happen in isolation. It's all very true. One of the common calls that we get from families are those, who are either caring for a spouse who've had a stroke or, have some form of vascular dementia, but they're also still supporting grandchildren, they're working, or they have children at home that are still there, or grown children but still require support. And so this idea that a lot of family caregivers feel like they're trying to do it all themselves. And they're trying to do it all. They're trying to be something to everybody. And within that, their own self can get lost in that process. 35% of all caregivers are working, which is another important piece. And I know for many individuals that are younger and dealing with brain injury, that's often the case too. And even the person affected by brain injury is also looking at continued purpose and meaning, and so that becomes often a theme with individuals or families that are dealing with acquired brain injury or traumatic brain injury or stroke, is this idea of balancing work and also the financial impact and figuring out how do they, caring for children, still having that purpose and meaningful activities. Okay, just going to skip that slide. I think sometimes people think that family caregiving is this personal care. And really what we find is that family caregivers do a lot of different activities. There's this, they can help with transportation, they can help with medical treatments, they can help with care coordination. Certainly some provide personal care. They help coordinate appointments, they provide emotional support. So it's really varied what family caregivers do. But what we do know is that there's a major growing problem in caregiver distress. So 31% of all caregivers indicated they were feeling more distress. And so this idea of how do we support family caregivers is really important because they're also doing the bulk of the care, whether it's coordination or this idea of, they take on what we call caregiver burden, and that is the extent to which caregivers, sort of perceive that caregiving has this adverse effect on their emotional, social, financial, physical, and spiritual functioning. And it really is, it differs between each caregiver. That is a very individual experience, but there's the common theme of caregiving burden or caregiver burden. So we've talked about some of the challenges, this idea of feeling overloaded, exhausted, trying to do it all, difficulty setting boundaries. And that's also very true for working with individuals whose brain have been impacted. There's can be complex family dynamics, their roles change. Sometimes we have to have these very difficult conversations. Caregivers often feel isolated because their support networks change. There can be financial and legal concerns. It's difficult to navigate the healthcare system. So all of those challenges are very, very real. We do like to highlight some of the signs of caregiver stress to help educate caregivers, but also to help educate other individuals' support networks so that they can be better informed as well. Sometimes we see that there's a real kind of denial about the situation. Sometimes it comes out in anger towards other people, towards themselves, towards the care recipient. A lot of anxiety about the future, feeling socially isolated, exhausted, this feeling of lack of hope or a depression, not sleeping as well, a real change in the emotional reactions. Those are some of the signs of caregiver stress. And being aware is one of the first signs. Acting on it is a different step. We also just like to remind family caregivers that they are twice as likely to have a chronic health condition. And all of those, higher levels of stress, which can lead to, high increases in blood pressure. Their immune systems are typically compromised. They usually sleep less. They have, more levels of anxiety, back injuries. So the impact is quite real. And even though the ability to manage or coping is often what we'll hear from family caregivers, sometimes it's a very gradual impact. And so there can be lots of warning signs, but it's not until we go over the cliff that we really realize the impact of caregiving. So I'm just going to skip through some of those slides. What are caregivers really, what do they need? So what we hear on the caregiver support line, people call us, is that caregivers are in need of information, resources, this kind of know-how, someone to listen to without judgment. And with that is a form of self-care. They're typically on the edge of things like depression, injury, burnout, on top of working full-time or even part-time, being a parent, being a care manager for the person that they're supporting. And they often feel that they're on the outside of the care team or really being visible in community. So issues for family caregiving, which we had just touched on quickly, is this idea that sometimes family caregivers don't self-identify. The focus of the care is typically on the care recipient, the person who's experiencing. So in this case, brain injury, stroke, motor vehicle accident. This approach of a one-time offer is usually not accepted. It can take a while before family caregivers are ready to accept help. And this idea that it's not a one-size-fits-all. So the research shows that caregiver support is very multi-intervention. And so, one phone call doesn't cut it for everybody. A virtual support group doesn't cut it for everybody. Sometimes it's different types of interventions or support at different times, which makes it a little more complex. So part of this idea of this check-in and self-care is also recognizing within ourselves what kind of support do I need, do I want, can fit into my life right now. So one of the things that we speak to a fair amount in the caregiver journey is asking yourself, how is my current self-care right now? How resilient do I feel? So if something else happened in my life that was going to affect our family, like an unexpected health situation, or if I lost, a contract or a job, how resilient would I feel? What do I need for support? And support, that could be my social support, my educational support, my physical support, and where do I go? So again, if something, where do I turn for help? Who do I have in my circle? So as we also know with caregiving, and the reason why self-care is so essential for family caregivers, and I want to put in sort of this caveat that I recognize it's easy for health and social service professionals, to tout or to say it's really important that you care for yourself. We understand it's very difficult. It's very difficult to put ourselves first when there are so many other parts of caregiving or life that seem to be a higher priority. So I like to say that first. But so self-care really is essential for family caregivers because it can start as a gradual or it can be part of a crisis. So typically with a brain injury, it is more of a crisis. So something's happened and there's an acute situation and the families are having to respond. Sometimes it's a matter of life and death. Sometimes it's a matter of we don't know what's going to happen or how that person's going to recover. So in the second breath, it's usually not predictable. So we don't know when we're going to get thrown into this role. And most of us, don't have space in our life to be a caregiver. It usually happens when life is already full. And so as family caregivers, we usually try and squeeze it in already to a busy life without letting anything else go. And that's another reason why self-care can be really challenging. Because it can feel like it's one more thing for us to fit into our lives. So we reference this, family caregiving is, what happens when your sprint turns into a marathon. So most of us can go fast from time to time. We can push the boundaries of our energy and we can burn the candle at both ends. But once the urgency is over, we return. We have to find this way to return to this more balanced way of living as a caregiver or caring for someone with a chronic illness. That's the pace. We want to try and, there's going to be some sprints, but we also need to look at the approach as caregiving as a marathon. We're going to just touch on this a little bit, this idea that caregiving, it becomes the new normal of our life. And with that, it requires energy, emotional energy, physical energy. So one of the areas that we really focus on, and it's just this idea of self-awareness. So what is self-awareness? It's this idea to know your internal state, the check-in with yourself, preferences around how you might use a resource or what you need to make yourself feel good about yourself or accepting or being kind to yourself. It's based on your values. And so just having self-awareness or starting that process can really help you monitor your internal thoughts, your language, your emotions as they arise. And sometimes awareness is the most critical piece because if we're not aware, it's hard for us to take action. So self-awareness is part of self-care, but I would say self-awareness is one of the most important first steps for family caregivers. And so this idea of, and self-care looks very different for very different people. So sometimes self-care is just simply acknowledging how you feel and knowing that it's okay to feel that way. Sometimes that permission to feel that way is it might seem like a very small, part or not really important, but it is actually a really critical part of self-care. This idea of being able to see and hear yourself in a situation and having awareness into that. Knowing what brings you comfort in those difficult or ongoing challenges. And identifying what can bring you comfort and what's going to meet your needs. And that's going to look very different for all of us. And then how you integrate some type of activity, whether it's meditation, a morning walk. I call them, kind of my non-negotiables. A journal, sleep, whichever one, or 2 or 3 or however many, creates this sense of comfort and well-being for yourself. That's really at the root of self-care. So, and I think it's this really important piece that we don't just check in once with ourselves and then we're like, great, we know what our path of self-care is. It's actually that self-care can change, and it will change over time. So it is about this idea of what's going to support me in this moment. So sometimes it's just simply being aware of how we're feeling. Other times it's like, okay, well, I'm going to want a mindfulness practice. Sometimes it's just a long walk on your own. Sometimes it's calling a friend, whatever that looks like. That's all self-care. And one of the things that we really like to focus on is that self-care isn't necessarily self-improvement. So activities of self-care can be beneficial and have a positive outcome on your health. But the main goal of self-care are to meet your own needs and to feel better cared for and more grounded. So strategies, self-care strategies. Our focus is around self-compassion, connection, how we support ourselves personally, this idea of trying to find balance, how to feel more resilient, and of course, working towards an action plan. So Dr. Kristen Neff is this amazing world-leading expert on self-compassion. And if you have a chance to delve into self-compassion, I really recommend, starting with her work. It's really wonderful. She describes it in a way that can really get. And it's really this idea of how we would treat a friend if that friend started speaking poorly about themselves, or needed more comfort. We would acknowledge and provide this comfort for our friend and say, my gosh, you're doing an amazing job. You're doing the best you can. We all make mistakes. So it's using that language and that that compassion for others and applying it to ourselves. Sometimes the mouse works, sometimes it doesn't. Here we go. Self-compassion, it leads generally to feelings of happiness, more optimism, gratitude, life satisfaction. It is linked to better coping and resiliency in the face of some really demanding situations. So that's why this idea of practice of self-compassion, the language we use with ourselves, is one of the most, critical aspects of self-care. So self-compassion is really about self-kindness, this mindfulness of where we're at in this moment, and this idea that what we're going through is very unique, but it can also be a very common experience. So that's sometimes why connecting with a peer is really helpful, because you realize that your situation is unique, but it's also a common experience by other people in the world. And so you feel less alone. Being kind to ourselves leads to a better outlook on current situation or our current caregiving role. And this mindfulness, this idea of self-awareness of ourselves and how we want to be, or how we want to look after ourselves, and focusing on our breath or focusing on what's going to give us comfort in that moment, are really those kind of 3 pillars of self-compassion. So this idea of connection. Well, caregivers often express they feel quite isolated, and it's completely understandable. They're often so busy and consumed by all the things they have to juggle, that often things like friendships go by the wayside. They end up kind of neglecting their social health, or they don't want it in that time. And I think all of us, most of us have a really hard time asking for help. It's not just caregivers, but it ends up also being caregivers. We have this real value placed on our independence, and we worry about being a burden to others. And sometimes what I hear from family caregivers is that their friends also don't always want to hear about the negativity or the challenges. And so it can be hard to connect with friends and feel free to talk about, their worries, their anxiety. They don't want it to dictate every single conversation. So some practical strategies in self-care in sharing the care, recognizing it can be hard to let go of control. But this idea of making caregiving sustainable, which of course is another form of self-care, is that this idea of trying to increase support. Sometimes there's very practical aspects, like sometimes there's just a list of things that have to get done. And sometimes we have, one or two people in our lives that are able and willing to commit to certain tasks. And so sometimes that's, a really good place to start. Sometimes family caregivers just, they need a bit of help with some very practical aspects. And so taking time to sort of list that and see if there's anyone that can help support that is one strategy. And the other piece, of course, is whether or not it's possible in the community. And of course, COVID's a little bit different right now in terms of what kind of respite is available or personal interactions. But being able to understand, what's available out there around getting support that you need. And most individuals have maybe already done that, but it's always good to revisit it once in a while. And also this idea of asking or, bringing in the mindfulness of where are your sticking points, where, like, letting go of control, or are there feelings of guilt around reaching out and asking for help. Sometimes that's also good to identify because it helps bring awareness of, maybe some reluctance to ask or receive in care. And so sometimes that's another really important piece to think about. There are some great virtual right now caregiver support groups. And I'm sure, Adrian can speak to some of the virtual caregiver support groups for brain injury specific. If there are any, I'm a little out of the loop in that regard. But with Family Caregivers of BC, there are some general caregiver support groups and virtual ones. And that for some individuals can be really helpful. Sometimes speaking to a caregiver coach, such as myself, is really helpful because you get some one-to-one time. And it is around your own action, your own self-care, or how to navigate a situation or problem solve. So that's another type of support that's available. And this idea of your circles of support, and that can change as a caregiver, and it can change depending on the person and the disease being cared for. So this idea of not hoping that the support is there, but being a bit more mindful around it. So checking in, who do you have in your circle of support? And what role can they play if you need them? So sometimes for some family caregivers, it's about like a contingency plan. If they weren't able to care, who around them could pick up those pieces, and creating this circle of support and just spending some time thinking about that and knowing who's in the community to support. So we were talking a bit about asking for and accepting support from this circle of support or from your circle of support. Typically we talk about this idea of following up. We talked a bit about being quite specific in the task, and in this idea of appreciating and validating the support that people are providing for us can go a long way. This idea around finding balance while we're caregiving, I just touched on this idea of contingency planning. So one of the areas that we will ask in some of our calls is to say, well, if something happens to you, who will take care of the recipient? And then who's going to take care of you? How will the rest of your family manage? And if you're not able to, the kind of then what? And it's not to put more pressure on caregivers. It's more to say, okay, what can you do to keep yourself as healthy as possible, knowing that you want to be in this role, knowing that there are also some risks to that role. So how do we manage that? Or how do we try and find strategies to help manage that? Resiliency, we also, this idea of having a contingency plan or looking at ways to keep us more resilient or accepting some support we need to really helps build a much stronger foundation of caregiving. And resiliency isn't just one thing. It's really understanding, and we spoke to this a little bit earlier, this idea of how do you adapt in a healthy way to stress? When there's an acute or a sprint, how do you bounce back from that? And how is it your capacity to grow from an experience? So how are you able to reflect and learn and apply things going forward? Caregiving is it's a real growing journey for many caregivers. And there can be a lot of moving parts. And so resiliency is a really key aspect of self-care as well. It can actually, it leads to overall better well-being, but this idea of self-care also contributes to resiliency as well. So resiliency is actually, it's a learned skill. And so building resiliency really helps caregivers sustain their health and capacity to care. And it can help a caregiver's capacity to move through more difficult situations. Because typically with caregiving, especially with a chronic illness or, it changes over time. It usually doesn't get less. It usually gets more. And so how do we build our capacity and resiliency to learn and build on that for the future? It also reduces the caregiver's susceptibility to stress. Family Caregivers of BC has a really great flip book, and it is all about resiliency. And so I certainly encourage you to take a look at that. It's a really helpful read around understanding all the different areas of resiliency, and that each of us have different areas where we value more or less. And also I won't spend too much time on that today, but I encourage you to read it or to listen to one of the webinars on it. It's a really great resource for family caregivers. So I think what I will do is factor on this idea of resiliency, and that there are a number of factors. And so this idea of cultivating a positive outlook, this idea that accepting that life is imperfect, it's good to acknowledge how we're feeling, but staying too long with difficult thoughts usually doesn't help us. Anyone, whether we're a caregiver or not, trying to reframe stressful experiences. So really recognizing and validating caregiving that can be very stressful at times, and learning how to interpret and respond to those stressors, based on your own perceptions. Creating a network of connections. So we've talked about this idea of the importance of personal connections, and that also helps with resiliency. This idea, again, of coming back to self-compassion, so you can see how all of this, everything sort of weaves into self-care and to becoming or working on resiliency. So being very compassionate with yourself, believing in yourself, knowing how to bounce back from, a challenging situation. This idea of sticking with your moral compass. This idea that you're not losing sight of where you want to go, and so not losing yourself in the process, that your values and beliefs are really important in your own journey, whether it's emotional, physical, spiritual, and figuring out how do you take care of someone else and also take care of yourself, or how do you take care of yourself first and take care of someone else. This idea of really prioritizing your own physical well-being, we find that that's a real, really important part around, there's that link that moving our body in even small ways can help cleanse the mind of stress. And how do you create meaning in your caregiving role? So finding this positive meaning in being a caregiver also adds to this positive overall health. So having a sense of purpose in your caregiving role it leads to better outcomes. It'll help strengthen your relationship with the care recipient, and also taking pride in being a caregiver. Even if it's not always what you want, it is a part of who you are, and this idea of taking pride also helps in building resiliency. So this idea of taking action around self-care, resiliency, compassion, a lot of it comes back to the piece that we talked about, awareness. So how do you identify and advocate for your own needs? How do you take action when it feels impossible? So according to self-management research, the key is around an action plan. And by action plan, we don't mean, it has to be, something really formal and lots of different parts. It can be one step at a time. It can be a short-term action that's accomplished in a week or in a day. The research shows that keeping it short-term and very easy to reach really helps build confidence and success in developing these habits. And the idea is, that you're trying to break down into smaller steps to help move towards a bigger goal in the future. And really the plan is, how do you maintain or increase your well-being? So sometimes the question that we'll ask is, what's one stressor you'd like to reduce? Or what source of energy would you like more of? And even if you just did that alone, even if you just could identify that, that's also going to help, even just moving towards awareness and moving more towards self-care. Of course, around, action planning, it usually is very specific. So it is this idea of writing down one area. So what, I want to feel less overwhelmed each day with the amount of, to-dos on my list. And so what's one small action that you can do this week? And just, trying to drill down as much as possible. What will you do? How much will you do? When will you do it? And how often will you do it? So one important thing I think is that action planning, it does take, time and effort and energy. And so if that seems like too much, then even just bringing awareness into your self-care or into your current situation would be a really great first action step. So this kind of idea of dimensions of health, sometimes self-care, it's like people don't even really know necessarily how to even start. And so there's a whole area of dimensions of health. And so sometimes, people say, well, I want to feel, kind of good about myself, or I want to have better coping skills, or I want to, participate in activities, more social activities. I want to, engage more with certain relationships. I want to be able to feel better physically, or I want to have, look at my nutrition. Those are some of the different areas of self-care that caregivers will report on. And so one of the things that you can do is sort of take a look at those dimensions of health. And you could even just focus on one, and you would focus, one activity, and think about, okay, well, what's one activity that I could do? And, what do I need to do in order to make that happen in my life? So this kind of goes down a little bit more in more details around, like, what are you already doing? What can you do this week? How confident are you with that step? How will you feel when you're finished? And how will it help you reach your bigger goal? Is there something blocking? And we touched on this a little bit earlier around really kind of understanding what blocks us. Is there a way that you can reduce that barrier? And what do you need to make that happen? Learning is really important too, because sometimes it's, we try something, it doesn't work. Well, what did we learn from that process? And then what can you apply going forward? I think in terms of the whole dimensions of health and action planning, one thing I would say for family caregivers that do want to make it, that do feel like they're ready to make a change, or they want to, but they feel like they still want support, or they want support, is, being able to connect with someone that will help support them with that journey is really helpful. So reaching out to someone for support and saying, gosh, I really want to make a change. Will you just, can you sit down and help me figure this out? Or two brains are usually better than one. Although I say, except for teenagers, where two brains is like equals to half a brain. But that you're not alone, that there are resources that can help you provide that support. You've got friends in your circle. You can call Family Caregivers of BC, you can call NBIS, and have someone, especially if you have a tool to help you, kind of move through that. I use that every day, in my current living, and I'm not currently caregiving. I'm always, reaching out to people to say, can you hear me out on this idea? Or I want to try and make this change, will you walk through the process with me? Just to remember, there's lots of really great caregiver resources out there. There's a toll-free support line. There is newsletters, there's specific resources. We've got tips and tools like this webinar that are posted. We do a Facebook Live twice a month. And so please, reach out to Family Caregivers of BC if we can be of further assistance to you. If we can provide some one-to-one support, we'd be more than happy to do that. Adrian knows how to get in touch, with me personally, but also, can get connected to the organization. And that's just a bit about how you can reach us. There's the support line 1-800 number. Right now, the caregiver support line's open between 8:30 a.m. and 7 p.m. Monday to Friday. And that's the end of our slide. That's the end of our show. Thank you very much for listening. And if we can be of further support or assistance, please reach out to us.
Well, thank you, Wendy. I really appreciate you sitting down with us. I know that sometimes even a presentation like this, it just gives people some motivation to kind of get started on their journey if they're feeling overwhelmed. So I really appreciate you coming. I like to steal you at least once a year to get you to share your wealth of knowledge. But yeah, just to let everyone know, we are, there we go. We are still open. We are not currently having walk-in clients, but we are open from Monday to Thursday, 9 to 4 by appointment only. And yeah, if anyone has any comments, feel free to reach out or come check us out on our website, www.nbis.ca, and we will see you on the next session. Have a great day.